Welcome everyone to our roadmap class. Today we are continuing into the book of Judges and continuing on from Joshua. And of course Judges is going to pick off right where Joshua left off. Just like Deuteronomy and Joshua left off with Moses dying and passing his leadership to Joshua. Joshua ended with the death of Joshua and with no successor to pass anything on to. And so Judges cover really this broad era within the Bible that covers the time through Joshua not having a successor until the first anointment of Israel's first king, Saul. So just a lot of chaos, a lot of anarchy during this time of this tumultuous period within the history of the Israelite people. And the book is structured pretty interestingly. So the first two chapters, chapter 1 and 2, covers the third generation. So Moses is the first generation, Joshua is the second generation, and this is the third generation without a clear leader. So the third generation and their failures are mentioned in chapters 1 and 2, and then the last part of Judges also covers the third generation, so chapters 17 through 21. And in the middle of those, we get an anthology of 12 of the judges of Israel. And many of you might not know exactly what a judge is, but a judge is essentially a leader chosen by God to rise up. The scripture will say that their spirit is gripped by God's spirit and will rise up and somehow free the Israelite people and liberate them from invaders. So if you remember, Joshua left the Israelites in kind of a tenuous position. The Israelites were coming to the promised land thinking, oh my goodness, God's going to come and save us and we're going to just, march through the land and everything's going to be like rainbows and puppy dogs and we're all going to live happily ever after in this land. And that doesn't end up being the case. Not all the land is conquered. There's a lot of holdings in certain enclaves within the land, and there's a lot of turmoil and chaos and disputes within the land and with the native people. And so you get kind of a mess that needs to be sorted out. And the Israelites are going to kind of see how to sort through this mess and through the leadership of these judges. And so we're going to focus on the middle part, the anthology of the 12 judges. But within those judges, there's really only 4 major judges that we're going to focus on. So the story of Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. Those are going to be the main storylines that we're going to find out about. And then after that, we're going to have 2 episodes, like we talked about, coming from the third generation. And we're going to go through this thematic motto that the author brings that says that it's going to be just a time of basically anarchy, and there's no king in the land of Israel. And some of the darkest chapters in the Bible actually is going to be on here. And chapter 19 in particular covers probably the worst section of sexual assault found in the entire Bible. So be ready for that. So due to time restraints, we're really going to start fast forwarding through the first part of the section. So I encourage you, if you have a full notes online, that you can look towards it and kind of see as I go through it really quickly. But essentially, the Judges opens, Joshua is dead, Hebrews don't know what to do, they go to God, inquire about them, and so the first chapter is basically talking about them overtaking the land, and it really focuses on Judah and their overtaking of the land in central Judea from the natives that are still among them. And the next part of the story is the conquest of Bethel and its capture in chapter 1, verses 22 through 26. And then we also have the failures, the many, many failures of how the Israelites fell back and went back to the idolatry of the tribes that were around the area and were unsuccessful in capturing most of the land back. And the next section, chapter 2, verses 6 through chapter 3, verse 4, is going to focus on the third generation. And this section really explains the cycle of the judges. So it'll talk about what happens in every judge narrative. There's going to be the same formula each time. There's going to be Israel sinning, people crying out, Lord, help us. The Lord hears their cries, gives them a judge or a leader that's going to break them out of their oppressors, these invaders that occupy the land. And then, everything is golden. You have an usher, an age of peace for such and such years, while the Israelite judge is in power. And then once they're gone, the next generation totally forgets them, and they're off sinning, and the cycle repeats, and off we go. So that's what we are to expect. And so that's really the beginning part. And now getting into the anthology, starting in chapter 3. We're first introduced to Othniel, which some don't consider a minor judge, but because of this story being so short, I kind of consider it. But essentially, you remember Othniel from Joshua. He was Caleb's relative who defeated the forces in Debir and Hebron and helped conquest that land. And so he was the first judge, and God gave him spirit to rise up against this foreign force in Syria called Cushan Rishaim. And so this king, which literally means like wicked evildoer in Hebrew, comes in for 8 years. Othniel defeats him, and then we get 40 years of peace. The next story is Ehud. You might be familiar when Dr. Timothy talked to him about him during his study in Judges. So Ehud has the same sort of formula go on. You have the Moabites being the oppressors in this story, and Ehud is this diplomat that disguised himself as a vassal. If you remember in ancient times, if you were the big bad conqueror of that time, you would annex all these lands, and all the natives of that land would give you tribute. You might be able to live the way you wanted to, but at the end of the day, you're still going to have to be paying your share of taxes to these superior forces that are under your rule. So Ehud is doing that, and they have typically a very elaborate ceremony. And during the ceremony, he gives kind of some intel about the palace and what's going on with the king called Eglon. And so afterwards, Ehud gives the tribute to the king and dismisses his entourage with him. And he goes up to the king, Eglon, and says, oh, by the way, God has a secret message for you. So he gets really close to the king, and the king goes and dismisses his entourage. And so he's just alone here with Ehud. And so after that, the king is just getting up on his chair. He's described as a especially heavy person, and so he's getting up. He's ready to hear what he thinks is a divine oracle, but instead gets a divine belly stabbing right up the stomach. And so Ehud stabs him, and it stabs him so deep, and his dagger is so short that it actually absorbs the handle. His fat goes around it and just completely goes inside of him. And of course he dies. Ehud gets out of there. The guards are coming back. They notice the door's locked because Ehud locked it, thinking that, maybe he's going to the bathroom or something. And later on opens it, discovers his dead body, freaks out, and then, everything is on fire. So Ehud goes back to his tribe, has a ram's horn call celebrating that the king has been dead. So everyone, their morale is up, everyone's uniting to fight against the Moabites, and so they have a confrontation at the Jordan River where the crossing is to get from Israel to Moab. And so they completely take over the crossing. They just slaughter all of the Moabites that are around there, and 10,000 is what Scripture records, and then Moab surrenders, and then there's 80 years of peace under Ehud. Then we have a really short story of Shamar that's kind of mentioned on a side note, but sometime during this time there's another judge who slew 600 Philistines with an ox goad. And if you don't know what that is, it's literally a little device that you would use to prod the cattle and direct them like a shepherd and get them to do what you want to do. So to take out 600 Philistines with it was quite a feat. So that is the story of the first three judges. And now we're going to turn to the main judges. And let's see if I get my slides working. Okay. And so one thing I forgot to mention was the location of all the judges. So one thing that's really a misunderstanding is the diversity of the judges. So the judges are coming from all different tribes, and instead of thinking about them in a big, national sense, they're really just regional powers that are at play here. Another big misconception is thinking that Israel is just one lovey-dovey, united tribe here to worship Yahweh, which that was certainly not the case at this time. So judges usually have to really work and scrap together to get the other tribes involved to help them defend their region against whether it's the Moabites or the Ammonites or whatever the new regional power threatening them is. So, and another misconception is thinking that these judges are especially good people. We'll see that they come through all walks of life. They come with all different backgrounds, all different occupations. Some of them less savory than others, but nevertheless God will use them to liberate the Israelites. So moving on to our major stories now, starting with the first one, Deborah. So once again, Israel goes astray, and we're introduced to King Jabin, who is taking over Hazor. So right up here in the red. So we're way up north part of Israel, and this region is being overtaken by Jabin's really impressive chariot force. Remember that the Israelites were very inferior as far as technology during this time. They didn't have fancy camels or cavalry or any sort of chariot unit. So these force of 800 were really dominant, or 900 were really dominant, and it was led by a guy named Sisera. And he ruled this region called the Jezreel Valley. And as we continue our stories in the Bible, this region is going to be really important. It's right not far away from the Sea of Galilee into this lowland area here. But it is a very combative area that we'll see. It's also the location of Megiddo. If you know the location of Armageddon in Revelation, it's in this field here in the Jezreel Valley. So that is where the big confrontation is going to take place. So we're introduced to a prophetess named Deborah, who is in Ephraim, who's actually below Manasseh here. And she gets a representative from Naphtali, from Kadesh, come to her to seek, how are we going to defeat this amazing force? And what Deborah says is she prophesies over this guy named Barak and tells him that the Lord is calling you to go and defeat King Jabin, and you're going to do it by conscripting these 10,000 military units from your tribe, which is Naphtali, and the nearby Zebulun and Issachar tribes, and you're going to make this united force to go and confront this force, Sisera and his chariot force, and the Lord is going to make you victorious. Barak says, okay, awesome, that's great, I'll go, but only if you come with me. So only if you will go, if Deborah will go with him, then he'll go. But Deborah says, okay, I'll go, but there will be no glory for you, because the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. The way she's saying it implies that, it might be Deborah who is going to be the one, but as we'll see, there's going to be a twist of the story of who actually defeats this general. So they go back up, way up north in Kadesh, and travel back to Barak's hometown. He goes and rallies the troops that he's needed, and he meets them down here, very close to the Sea of Galilee, in Mount Tabor, where the star is. And so this mountain is going to be where the army is going to rally, and Sisera is going to hear about this, and so his unit is going to come from this brook called the Wadi Karish, and they are going to set up this stream of water that's going to be at the foot of the mountain, and they're going to have their camp there. And so the troops are gathered, everyone's ready for a fight, and then Deborah just yells out, just has this rallying cry. The armies go, Barak and his 10,000 go down the mountain, and they attack Sisera's chariot army by the stream, and they just get completely bludgeoned and defeated. They are forced to flee from the battlefield, and Sisera is forced to go into hiding and try to seek refuge. So he's defeated, he's seeking refuge, and he goes and finds a tent by a Kenite. Kenites was the tribe that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had that were friends with the Hebrews, named Deborah, whose family was also friendly with Sisera's king in Hazor. And so his wife, Jael, greeted Sisera and invited him in and, made sure he's comfortable, gave him a blanket, gave him some milk, and soothed him to sleep. And once he was asleep, she grabbed a big old pin made to stake out your tent and took a mallet, put it on his head, and there was no more Sisera after that. So it wasn't Deborah who actually takes him out, it was this wife who assassinates him. And so Barak goes to her tent, pursuing Sisera, looking to take him out and in pursuit of him. And she's like, oh, here's the guy you're looking for. Shows him the dead body. And that was that. The army was defeated, and later on, King Jabin was defeated, and Deborah and Barak ushered in a year of 40 years of peace. And chapter 5 is pretty much like a song dedicated, celebrating the defeat and victory over Sisera. And there's a few more details you can look up if you get the full notes about that. Moving on, story number 2, Gideon. So this is a story you guys might be familiar with. Gideon comes up during a time where, once again, Israel sins, and this time it's the Midianites who are in power, overtaking the Israelites. And he is in a town of Orpha, and that is right near the Jezreel Valley as well. And he is one of the tribes in the western part of Manasseh. And this time, the Midianites are unique in the sense that they are primarily a raiding-based army, and they have a combined force with other raiders, namely the Amalekites and the Kedmites. You might remember the Amalekites were the marauders that did battle with Moses, the very first encounter that Joshua defeated. And so this force is going, and they're basically pillaging all of their agriculture that keeps them alive. So all their fields, all their cattle is being either put on fire or destroyed, and the Israelites are forced to hide all their grain inside of caves. And so we are introduced to a character named Joash, who is there beating his weeds in one of the sunk recesses in the caves, hiding out from this army. And his son Gideon all of a sudden encounters an angel, and the Lord proclaims this amazing message that Gideon is going to somehow rise up and deliver the Israelites from this great enemy, the Midianites. And Gideon argues with God, saying, God, why, we're been abandoned by the Lord. How can this be? And also, Manasseh had the reputation of being the least military abled of all the 12 tribes. So how can such a tribe like his possibly, defeat the Midianites? So Gideon is skeptical and has this test. You could read more about it in the book, but basically he puts a meal offering. Angels can't have meals, so instead of taking the meal, the angel will rise up his staff and it'll burst into flames. And Gideon's going to be super amazed because, oh my goodness, a real angel has encountered him. And so after, there's also a second part to this episode where later the Lord comes to Gideon again and tells him to tear down the altar of Joash. Remember, these God is not being worshipped at this time, and so you have the altars and cultic sites of these local Canaanite gods, mainly Baal in Manasseh, and God is telling him to go take out the site, and not only take out the wooden site, but to reuse that wood that you're taking, burn it up, and have a sacrifice burnt over the wood where the altar once was. And so Gideon and his 10 servants do exactly that. And the townspeople the next morning look and see, oh my goodness, who could have done this? Who could have insulted our god Baal? And find out that Gideon's responsible. And after that, they they say, oh my goodness, we have to put this boy to death. And so Joash, defending his son, smartly responds, well, if Baal's so tough, let him go and take vengeance on his own altar. And so from that moment on, Gideon got the name called Jerubbaal, which roughly translates saying, let Baal contend, or let Baal contend. And so that's kind of the origin story of Gideon. Later on, the Midianites and allies start to converge at the Jezreel Valley outside of Orpha, Gideon's hometown. And so Gideon is panicked, he rushes, he blows the horn, and he's trying to gather military help from the other tribes. And Gideon is still fearful of military calamity, even though he knows that the Lord has promised him victory, and asks for this really bizarre test where basically he's taking a piece of wool. He said, God, if you're really here with me, make sure that this cloth is going to be wet while the floor is dry from the dew in the morning. So the Lord does that, and then just to double check, he does the same thing the next night, except vice versa. So this time the floor is going to be wet and the strip of wool is going to be dry, and both tests are passed. So now he knows, the Lord's going to deliver this army to him. So Gideon's army is stationed at over here at the spring of Harod, and the right outside of Orpha, and the Midianites are stationed at a hill called Moreb. And the Lord is fearful that as they're about to take battle that Gideon's going to get credit for this victory. So he decides to tell, hey, go tell your soldiers, who's ever fearful, who's ever afraid, go back home, you're not needed. And he does that, so he dwindles his troops down from 22,000 down to 10,000. And the Lord was still not satisfied with this, so he makes this strange request and thought that, okay, go tell your men to go to the spring of Harod and go and drink some water and observe how they drink the water. And so most of them just kind of went on their knees and picked up the water and drank it from their hand. And there were about 300 others that went down on their knees and slurped it up like a dog. And God said, those dog slurpers, those are my guys. They're coming with me. Everyone else go home. So that's what happened. So Gideon takes his 300 dog slurpers into battle, and they go into battle, and they devise this really interesting tactic requiring absolutely no weapons. So what he does is at night they're going to do this ambush, and they're going to have 3 units of 100 each split up and surround the Midianite camp. And what they're going to be armed with is nothing but a ram's horn for noise and this little torch, this jar, this flammable jar that's going to burst into flames if they throw it. So they do that, and they go up with their plan. They surround the Midianites, and they just get super freaked out, and they're like, oh my goodness, they're thinking this huge, massive army is surrounding them, and they start getting confused and even killing each other, and they all flee, running away towards the river. And so the Midianites retreat towards the Jordan. Gideon sends messengers to the men of Ephraim to cut them out from the crossing the Jordan, to meet them there and to cut off the retreating troops. So the men of Ephraim do. They go, they cut off the troops, they kill them, and they also kill the 2 generals, Midianite generals named Zeb and Oreb, and bring their heads to Gibeon. So the men of Ephraim, after all that, you would think everyone's celebrating, everyone's, they're liberated, but instead the men are upset. They're like, Gideon, why didn't you invite me to the good party in the battle of Jezreel? Why wasn't I part of the troops of 300? But Gideon eased their anger by pointing out that, hey, you guys were awesome. You cut them off. You killed the generals, so you guys did great. So the men of Ephraim, their anger was resolved, but as we'll see later, that might not always be the case. So Gideon finishes the job. He tries to pursue the 2 kings of Midian, Deborah and Zalmunna. And so he's going east, pursuing them into the desert, going really, really far. And so he arrives at the location of Gilead to 2 towns called Succoth and Penuel. And there, the villagers are really skeptical that Gideon is going to somehow take out this king. And so they're like, yeah, like Gideon's like, hey guys, can you help us? We're needing food, needing nourishment. They're like, no, take your chances without us. And so Gideon gets really, really bitter and is like, okay, you guys are really regret this. And so he's really bitter, and he goes and he pursues the two kings anyways, finds them down here in Karkor, and defeats the two kings and captures them and brings them back. And as they bring them back, he actually goes back to those two villages to parade the two captured kings. And Gideon gets super duper petty and decides to get this boy in Succoth to go get him to recruit and find out where all the elders of the village are. And once he finds out all of them, he goes and he pushes them into a briar of thorns. And Penuel, he goes there, and just like he promised, he took out the tower there, killing a lot of the townsmen in the village. So really petty of Gideon to do all that. But he got his revenge and got rid of the Midianites. So he captures the two Midianite kings, tells them, interrogates them about their atrocities, and Gideon orders his oldest son, who is not really old at all, he's a little boy named Jezreel, to go and execute these two kings and set them straight. Of course, the young boy is super duper shy and timid and doesn't do so, and the kings just egg him on to kill him himself, and so Gideon does, and they are executed. So that is the end of the Midianites. Gideon returns to the village with his 300 soldiers who nevertheless don't really acknowledge God, but acknowledge Gideon to make this amazing feat, and they want him to be king of all of Israel and have his sons rule over them. But Gideon responds that no, Israel, the Lord your God, is the only God of Israel, that you will be your ruler. And so, as a commemoration of this victory, he requests that all the booty or all the treasures that were hoarded or looted from the Midianites are donated and brought into a heap of metal and formed into a sculpture commemorating this victory. And so they put that in the town center of Orpha, and later the Israelites will go astray and start worshiping this monument as an idol. But nevertheless, Midian submits to Israel, and there's 40 years yet again of peace. And there's a subsection in chapter 9 talking about Abimelech. And so after Gideon retires, he has a super duper amount of wives, and he has 70 children, and the most notable one is Abimelech, and he is from a concubine in Shechem. And after Gideon's death, Israel once again goes astray, and Abimelech sees an opening. So he goes and leaves Orpha, and he returns back to his biological mother's hometown in Shechem. He gets all this political support, he demagogues, he gets his relatives on his side, and later the whole village gets behind him, and he gets this new gang of loyalists back into Orpha, and he horrifically executes 68 of his brothers on a single slab stone in Orpha, with only his youngest brother Jotham being surviving this and going into hiding. So after this great massacre, Abimelech goes to Shechem, and he is proclaimed king there. And Jotham hears about this and goes out of hiding and shouts from Mount Gerizim and tells them about this parable. And to summarize the parable, basically he illustrates these trees that are desperately looking for a ruler to rule over them. And so they pass on 3 worthy candidates. He has like an olive tree, a fig tree, a grapevine, and all these great candidates reject being king over them. So they get so desperate that they go to this thorn bush, who is awful, who is both unworthy to be their king, and also will burn down the trees if they are any way disloyal to him. So Jotham explains this parable, and then leaves, fearing for his life, fearing his brother's wrath. But we will see how true his parable comes in the coming story. So Abimelech and his rules over Shechem, in Israel for 3 years, and then as the parable predicted, there will be a faction within Shechem that rejects Abimelech and regrets him being king, and they defect and they go to the nearby hilltops and live a life of off the grid as outlaws. And while they're doing this, they just so happen to cross roads with another outlaw with the gang, and his name was Gaal. So a guy named Gaal comes and inspires them to take back Shechem and take back control and overthrow Abimelech, and he becomes their new leader. So Abimelech is away from Shechem. He is in Arumah, and the governor watching over the city for Abimelech is called Zebul. So Zebul hears about this rebellion, tells Abimelech about it, and says, hey, you need to come back to the city because eventually God will come in and basically overtake Shechem. So Zebul asks for help. So once Gal has overtaken Shechem, Abimelech comes during the night. He hides in the moving shadows at night. Gal will see him and says, oh my goodness, I gotta go check out what's happening. He underestimates the amount of army soldiers that he has, and he loses, so he gets taken out and has to retreat back into Shechem. So he loses the battle, and that next day, Zebul will be able to retake power and control Shechem away from Gal. But again, there's another day where battle once again happens within the rebels, and Abimelech hears this and returns the battle to Shechem and completely takes no prisoners, completely captures the city, and in his zeal, he completely burns down and salts the entire city, his capital city, strangely. And it just shows the truth of that parable that, any sort of rebellion is going to have fire and fury, in this case, literally burn down the city. So he had really no loyalty to any particular city, but really his own power. So the rebels are panicking, they don't know what to do, so they go ahead and retreat into two different locations. There's like a citadel tower right outside Shechem that many of them go to, and then there's another village called Thebez with a citadel that they go and retreat to. So the nearby tower, Abimelech will go, and instead of taking out the tower, what he'll do is he'll chop down trees, take it over his shoulder, and lay it down at the entrance and light it on fire and kill everyone in the tower. So everyone dies in the Tower of Shechem. Next he goes to Thebez, does kind of the same thing to the citadel, but as he's doing it, there's a woman that chucks down this millstone, and it nails Abimelech right in the head. So he is having a mortal injury on his head. He's humiliated, and as he is dying from this injury given to him by a woman at the window, he is ordering his armor bearer to kill him, to stab him. The armor bearer does, and he dies, and after that point, the loyalists really, the fire under them quenches, and they are able to call off the rebellion and go back to their homes. So the next story that we're going to be introduced to is Jephthah, number 4, or number 3 of the major judges. And the beginning and the end are going to talk about 5 minor judges. So if you want to look at the beginning and end, note that they're there at the beginning of chapter 10 and the end of chapter 12. Jephthah occurs during the Ammonite oppression. So the Ammonites are ruling over the Gilead, the area around Succoth and Peniel, and they have no idea what to do. Like, they just overbear them, and they are desperate to find any soldier. And in fact, if anyone is even brave enough to go and confront the Ammonites, that person is going to be commander over their army. So we're introduced to this guy from Mizpah called Jephthah. And he is the illegitimate son of a man named Gilead. And when Gilead's wife's sons grow up, they want to make sure that Jephthah has nothing to do with their inheritance. So they kick him out, put him into exile, and he goes out to the land and becomes an outlaw, a really talented bandit. And so as the Ammonite seizes Gilead and the elders get desperate, they desperately want to recruit back Jephthah to come and fight on their behalf, and even offers him to be commander of their army. So Jephthah agrees, and at first, instead of having an all-out war, he tries to be diplomatic to the Ammonites. And in this section, it's really interesting. I really like how a lot of sections of the Bible retell stories of old and have kind of a new light to it. And so Jephthah says the same thing with the Transjordan invasion that happened when Moses took over the Ammonites in the book of Numbers. And he argues that basically the Ammonites were here first and Moses should have not have invaded. But Jephthah makes his argument saying, well, why was this a problem 300 years ago? That was 300 years ago that Moses came, and it hasn't been a problem since. And long story short, they couldn't come to agreement, and war was declared. So the Ammonite king goes. Jephthah is prepared to cross over to the Ammonite camp, and before his army goes over, he makes a vow, a really bizarre vow that is not really explained well, where he says that he will sacrifice to the Lord whatever comes out of his house when he comes home after the victory. So Jephthah does that. He completely beats the Ammonites. He comes home, and just what happens when he comes home? The first thing he sees is his daughter, his one and only daughter, running and playing the timbrel, celebrating his great victory. And Jephthah is torn. He tears his clothes. He tells the daughter about the foolish vow that he did, and that it cannot be undone. So the daughter is strangely gleeful and says that, you did the battle, you did what was supposed to happen, and the Lord is going to respect your vow. So she just makes one request. The daughter says, just give me 2 months to live my life out, go with my friends and lament at the hills, and Jephthah does so. And so for 2 months, the daughter goes and has her time to lament. 2 months are over, Jephthah returns and does the deed. So he goes and sacrifices his daughter as a burnt offering, inferring that she becomes completely consumed by fire. It later becomes a custom for this tragic event that maidens throughout Israel will chant laments or dirges of Jephthah's daughter 4 days of the year in celebration, or not in celebration, but in sorrow for this really sad event. So at the end of Jephthah's chapter, there is a civil war that ensues. So just like Gideon, the men of Ephraim wanted to be part of this war. And so they come from this north section and they confront Jephthah saying, hey, why didn't we get any of the action this time? And Jephthah explains, well, you guys were already called, but you didn't come to help. And so this argument does not go well. Unlike Gideon, who was very diplomatic, Jephthah is not, and war ensues. And so Jephthah's army from Gilead goes and completely demolishes the Ephraimites and overtake the Jordan River here and the waterways, the crossings. And an interesting observation is to make sure to see if there was an Ephraimite or someone from Gilead that's crossing the river while it's being guarded by Jephthah's men. They have a test. So it's called the Sibling Test. So Shibboleth has a H in it. But for whatever reason, in the Ephraimites had an accent, so they didn't say sh, they said sib, so they just said Sibboleth. And so if they said that and they mispronounced it, they knew to go and kill that Ephraimite, and so that's how we get that word where that meaning comes from. So interesting fact there. Anyways, it's really tragic. Ephraim ends up having 42,000 other men killed by Jephthah's army. And Jephthah becomes judge of Israel for 6 years and is buried in his hometown in Gilead. Our last story from the Judges come from Samson. So this is one that many of you may be familiar with. So we have the story of, we start out in the place of Dan. So Dan is going to be towards the Mediterranean Sea, next to where Judah is. And so the Israel once again sins, falls into the hands of the Philistines, and are oppressed for 40 years. And an angel comes to a man named Manoah, who has a barren wife. And an angel appears to the wife saying that she's going to bear a son, and he's going to live the life of a Nazarite. Remember, the Nazarite requirements is a strict custom that non-priestly people can do to be closer to God, to take on these disciplines. And so the angel says that she is going to be a Nazarite as long as Samson, or the baby's going to be in the womb, and the baby will grow up as a Nazarite, meaning that they're not going to have any wine, they're not going to touch anything unclean, and they're not going to have their hair cut. And so this baby that is being born is not only going to be a Nazarite, but will be the Savior who is going to save Israel from the Philistines. And so after this, Manoah hears about this and asks to see this angel. God does, and tells him, repeats the same thing the wife did, and and kind of like the same thing with Gideon. Manoah tests him by offering him a meal and asking him his name, and both times the angel can't do either, and again puts on fire the offering that they would have been the meal offering, and then vanishes. And then is born Samson. Is eventually born. So Samson is born. He grows up in their hometown in Dan called Zorah, and Samson will travel to a nearby village named Timnah and finds this attractive Philistine woman, and returns to his parents, asks, like, "Mommy, Daddy, can I please marry the nice Philistine woman?" And remember that marriage back then was a family arrangement, so the parents were in charge of marriages. And of course they wanted him to marry someone within the tribe, but he was persistent, and they're like, okay, whatever, we'll give in. And so they go back to Timnah to find this Philistine woman. On the way, Samson gets lost, falls astray, runs into a lion, kills it with his bare hands, as you do, and finds a woman, and has a great conversation with her, and it leads to a proposal that she accepts. So he's really thrilled, goes and tells his parents, and on his way to find his parents, he goes back to that lion carcass again, and in that carcass, bees are making wild honey, and he goes and he dips his fingers in, tastes some honey, and it just gets him super excited. He's like, you know what, my parents would love honey from a dead carcass of a lion, so he goes and takes it to his parents as well. Obviously, they have no idea where it came from. So they celebrate, they're preparing this wedding feast, and they're going to host it over in the woman's father's house over in Timnah. And because Samson is a stranger there, they have to make these wedding guests, companions for Samson. So they assign him local villagers to come be his entourage during the 7-day festival. And so a lot of times you'll have partying games and entertainment during this. And so Samson really makes things interesting as a form of entertainment to have this riddle be solved. And so he makes this high-stake riddle challenge. And the riddle has he says for all the 30 of them to give him his clothes and a set of clothes, or vice versa. If he can solve the riddle, then he'll give them the clothes. And so the challenge is who can solve it first. If they can solve it, then he'll do it, and if they can't, then they'll get the clothes, and so on. And so they accept the challenge, and they are just stumped. Basically, the riddle has to do with that lion and the honey. So they're really, really stumped about this riddle. And 3 days go by. On the 4th day, they just go ahead and just get to the point. They go to his wife and basically extort her, saying, if you don't get this information from your husband, we're going to burn your house down. So that was really persuasive, apparently, because the wife then goes to Samson really desperately and just nagging him to say, hey, what is the answer to this riddle? So many days go by, and on the 7th day, he finally just breaks and is like, okay, this is the answer. So the wife knows about it and then goes and tells the companions. And so the companions go right before the 7th day is over, and oh my goodness, now he's on the line to get all these clothes all of a sudden. So Samson's upset. He knows how they knew about it. He knew that the wife told him. So he's really, really mad. So he's actually forced to go to Ashkelon, this major Philistine, one of the 5 major Philistine cities, goes, kills 30 men, steals their clothing, and goes back and gives the companions those 30 clothes. So, what's a marriage party without getting gifted clothes from 30 dead people from Ashkelon? So he does that, and then after that, he is just really, really furious. He just completely leaves his wife. He goes back to his parents' hometown and just completely ignores his new wife. So the father of the wife is worried and just decides to go and remarry her to one of the companions that David had during the wedding party. And so during the harvest season is coming up, Samson gets remorseful. He decides to go back to his wife and reconcile, but the father gives him the bad news that she's already taken by one of the companions of the wedding, and so Samson's even more furious. He's super upset, and to take out his anger on the nearby Philistines during the harvest season, he decides to round up 300 of these foxes, light their tails on fire, and just have them go wild, and just basically break into a big wildfire with all their grain being burnt up. And so that happens. The Philistines are obviously not very happy about it. Hears that Samson's responsible, decides to get even with him by going and killing his wife, by burning her and her father's house while they're in it. Samson gets word of this. He gets super upset. He goes, beats up the men, and goes and hides because there's too many of them. So he goes to Judah and hiding from the men. And so the men will go into Judah looking for him. The Judites find Samson in hiding, and they're like, you are giving us so much trouble. Dan and Judah are in good terms, but Samson's just a whole lot of trouble, so they decide to turn him in. And Samson's like, okay, cool, whatever, just make sure just to tie me up. Don't kill me, just tie me up. So he's tied up. He goes, presents him to the Philistines. All of a sudden, he gets this superhuman strength, breaks out of his bonds, and takes out 1,000 of his pursuers by a jaw of a donkey, famously. So that is the first episode about Samson. The next episode about Samson mainly takes place in Gaza. So sometime later, Samson travels to Gaza and indulges himself at a local brothel, as you do. And at this local brothel, word gets out that Samson's there, so the Philistines are plotting a way to kill him, and they plot that, okay, whenever he wakes up, they're going to wait in the morning at the town gate and assassinate him. And so, unfortunately, at midnight, Samson foils their plans. At this amazing feat, he literally wakes up, grabs the entire gatepost, lifts it up where the men are hiding, runs and takes it 35 miles up a hill, and pots it down there as a memorial. So that is quite something. So obviously the people at Gaza are super not happy about this, and finds a way to get even and beat him through his love interest. So there's another woman in his life, and unlike the first wife, it says that Samson loved this particular woman, and her name was Delilah, and she was from a village called Wadi Sorik. And so the Philistines from Gaza learned about this, and the 5 lords or the 5 kings of Philistine go and try to get Delilah to sell out Samson for them, to bond him and find out his secret. And for this, she's going to be offered all this silver. And Delilah is super duper happy. She accepts. And so Delilah is more than happy to betray her lover. And so she does these 3 attempts. There's these 3 different bonds that happened, and each time is kind of the same thing. These bonds trap him. Samson breaks out, or Delilah will yell, "Oh my goodness, the Philistines are upon you." He breaks out, and it turned out that Samson lied. So he'll say something, it's not true, and the cycle comes on 3 times. But on the 4th time, you know what? Delilah has had enough and says, "Samson, if you really love me, if you truly, truly love me, you would tell me the secret of your power." And Samson, just like his first wife, gets so annoyed, so irritated. The scripture says he's literally he literally wants to die, essentially, and he's just resigned to die. And so he goes and tells her that about his Nazirite vow, that if anything were to touch his hair, cut it off, then his strength would be lost. So with that knowledge, she gets super excited, goes, gets the 5 kings, and gathers them. And so they come, she tells them everything, they give her the silver, and then that night, Delilah will go soothe him, and whenever he goes to sleep, she's going to get one of the Philistines to come help bond him and cut off his hair. And once that happens, she does it once again. Oh my goodness, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He wakes up and what? He can't get out. So he's trapped, he's struggling. And so as he's trying to get out and trying to leave, he's bonded and he's taken back to Gaza. So he's in custody. He has his eyes gouged out so he can't see, and he becomes humiliated and becomes a slave down in Gaza. So meanwhile in Gaza, the kings are celebrating. There is a great celebration at the temple of their god named Dagon, which literally means fish god. So this temple of Dagon, the god of the Philistines, are celebrating this great defeat of their enemy Samson and offer a great sacrifice and break into song and dance. And they're like, hey, you know what? This party's just getting started. Let's bring out that slave Samson and laugh at him and humiliate them. So they're like, what a great idea. Let's do that. So they fetch a boy to go and get Samson from his prison. And so Samson, and they place him right at the center of the temple in between the pillars. And so before the boy leaves Samson, Samson asks the boy, hey, can you just lead my hands to where the pillars are so I can lean against them? So the boy does. And so there's about 3,000 Philistines. There's the kings there, and they're all having a good time, and they're demanding Samson dance. And as that's happening, Samson's just getting erupted. He's getting upset, and he's like, Lord, please, as one last plea, can I take vengeance upon the Philistines? So with one last ounce of strength, he leans against the 2 pillars, takes a hold of it, and then God gets him his strength back, and he's able to take down the 2 pillars, collapsing the entire temple in and of itself, killing everyone inside. And so after that, Samson's kinsmen from Zorah go and gather his body and bury him at his father's grave. And the story ends out with saying that he led Israel for 20 years. So those are the stories of the 12 judges mentioned in the book of Judges. Now the last part is 2 episodes that talk once again about the sins and depravity of the Israelites, and showing just how dark things got during this time of anarchy. The first episode is going to talk about a Levite named Jonathan and the tribe of Dan, and it's going to illustrate the depravity of the spiritual and ritual lives of the Israelites. The second episode is going to talk about the moral horrendousness of the Israelites. And so, if you look at episode 1, that's going to be chapter 17 and 18. So we're introduced to a man named Micah and his mother. So there is this guy and his mom up in the hills of Ephraim, and Micah has Micah's mother is missing 1,100 shekels, which is a lot of silver. It's so much shekels, in fact, that it's the amount of money that Delilah was bribed to sell out Samson. So she has all these shekels of silver, and she's placing a curse on whoever stole this is gonna really have it. So Micah admits that, Mom, it's me, I took the silver, and I'm returning it, I'm super duper sorry. So the mom hears him and says, bless you, son. You know what, in fact, because of your honesty, I'm going to take 200 of these shekels and I'm going to form this image, this carved image out of it. So they make this image that's transformed, and then Micah decides to really make this household just surround and become this cultic center around this image that his mother made. And so he makes a replica of all the Levitical priestly vestments, and he even recruits his sons to become priests over this mini temple of his. And of course, those hearing this in the original audience would know that this is just completely abhorrent just disregarded the Levitical laws and a perversion of them. So that's what this story is really illustrating. So one day, there's this young Levite who we later will know to be Jonathan, and he travels from Bethlehem as a traveler, and he is without money or a livelihood, and he is just finding a shelter wherever he can. So during his journey, he runs into Micah's house, and Micah greets him and not only lets him a place to stay, but says, hey, you know what, I'm going to give you a great wage, and you get to be the priest of my little temple. And the Levite is so desperate that he accepts. And this gives Micah so much glee because now it gives him legitimacy. He actually has one of the tribes, the priestly tribes of Israel, gives him his new temple a lot of legitimacy now. So he's happy. Meanwhile, while this is happening, the tribe of Dan is being overtaken. So they are getting kicked out. Remember, they're out west here near the Mediterranean Sea. And they're getting conquered, and they're being kicked out, and now they're having to send scouts to look out for new prospects for land. So during that, they send out 5 spies, and these 5 spies leave and come upon Micah's house in the hill country. And in there, they are amazed when they meet the Levite named Jonathan. And so they ask him, like, hey, I recognize your accent. So the Danites, remember, they're really close to Judah, and so he notices his accent's from Judah, not from Ephraim. So he's like, oh, how did you end up here in this house? And he explains, oh, well, my master Micah invited me and hired me as a priest. And the Danites are really impressed. They're like, oh my goodness, great, we need spiritual guidance. Can you inquire the Lord for us to see if our success in finding a land is going to happen? And Micah does, or the Levitical priest does, and gives them affirmation that they're going to find their land. So later they go and move on and find way up north to Laish, and find this really isolated, nice piece of real estate that's not defended, it's not doing trades with anybody, and it's completely peaceable and had never experienced war. And they're like, wow, what a perfect place to completely invade and overtake. And so they go report this back down to Zorah and Ishmael. And from there, the Danites get super excited. They send out 600 men to go and overtake this land. So they go, and on their way, they once again, they go south through Bethlehem, and they come up here back to Micah's house. And the 5 scouts go and revisit. And just as the time says, full of anarchy, because why not? They go into Micah's house and just steal all the stuff. They just go, take the idol, take the idols in the other idols in there, take the ephod, investments, and the Levite, Jonathan, goes and confronts them, and they're like, hey, what are you guys doing? Knock this off. And instead, the Danites, the scouts, go and talk to him. He's like, hey, you are just a priest of this household. How would you like to be a priest of the entire tribe? And Jonathan's like, whoa, that's an offer I can't refuse. So goes, sells himself out, goes and takes the stolen object and goes away with the Danites. So the Danites are some ways away. Micah gets wind of this. He's like, oh my goodness, who stole my stuff and my priest? Let me go get them. So he goes with his townsmen to confront the tribe of Dan. And the Dan says something really snarky, smart remark back to him, and he realized quickly that, okay, these guys are going to do some harm to me. So Micah goes with his head down and goes back to his house in shame, and that's the last we hear of Micah. And so Dan will go on to conquer Laish, completely decimate the land, and will install the Levite, Jonathan, as their priest there, and install the household idol as their cultic center there. And there is a twist ending at the end of the story where we learn not only the Levite's name Jonathan, but we learn that Jonathan is son of Gershom, son of Moses. Really big twist ending, because for whatever reason, his lineage was never significant or made significant, which was strange given his connection to God. But we find out his grandson becomes this rebellious cultic leader for the tribe of Dan. And the scripture says that this cult and Jonathan and his household will become the priests for the tribe all the way up until Dan's destruction in 2 Kings chapter 15 verse 29, where Assyria will overtake Dan and defeat or completely obliterate the northern kingdom. So really, really interesting story. Shows the darkness of the religious life of the Israelites during that time. Our second episode about the Levite, another Levite, and the horrific death of his concubine, talks about the complete and utter moral failings of the tribe of Israel. So there's this Levite and his concubine who lives in the hill country, who's not Jonathan, but he also lives around the hill country where Micah house is, and he takes this concubine from Bethlehem to go and to take her into his household. And so there's some sort of dispute that we don't know about that's not really described in Scripture, but from what we can tell, they basically went their separate ways. So the concubine went back to Bethlehem, the Levite went back to Ephraim. And so after a while, he gets really regretful. He's like, oh, I need to win back and woo back my concubine. So he decides to go with his attendant to visit his father-in-law and reconcile with his concubine. So he travels, he's warmly received. His father is insistent, he stays there for a night, but for a few nights, and then on the fifth night, he's finally like, okay, we really got to go. And goes, packs his concubine, packs his attendant, and even though it's getting late, he nevertheless wants to get on the road back to Ephraim. So he's going, he's departing on the road, and on his journey there, he is experiencing, like, night falls upon him, so he knows that there's going to be marauders, there's going to be raiders, he needs safety, he needs a place to lay his head at night, and so he comes across Jebus, and if you remember Jebus, that is Jerusalem before Israelites took it over, and the attendant's like, oh, let's just go to these Jebusite lands and just kind of, lay low and stay the night here. But the Levite was insistent and said, no, we must stay with our brethren, our fellow kinsmen somewhere, and stayed with them, which will be ironic later because they trusted their tribe instead of strangers. So a bit of irony that's about to happen. And so they decide to go a little bit further at night and wait until they got into the region of Benjamin and stayed the night at a town called Gideon. So they stay at the Gibeah, they go to this town square, and what you would do back in this time, it was customary at night for travelers to meet at the town square, and for the natives who owned homes to go and find travelers and invite them into their home and give them lodging, give them food, and take care of them. That was kind of the norm at that time. Unfortunately, no one came, so they're waiting around, they're like, oh my goodness, there's not too many friendly people here. So they're just, the party's waiting around. And at last, an old man comes and happens to actually live near Ephraim, where the Levite's from, and gets off at a right good start, and comes and invites these travelers to come and stay at his house, and fully provides all their needs, feeds their cattle or donkeys, whatever they're in need of. And so it seems like everything's going well until it doesn't. So in an episode very reminiscent of Lot in Sodom in Genesis 19, the local men of Gibeah pound the door of the old man and demand to have their way with the male travelers inside there. The old man tries to reason with them to no avail, and of course, just like in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the men will throw the women under the bus and say, oh, no, the old man says, take my daughter, the Levite says, take my concubine. Of course, the men are not satisfied. They want the males. And so in a desperate act of self-preservation, the Levite will take his concubine, get her out, thrust her out the front door, shut the door behind her, lock the door, and let her fend for herself. And so she is there isolated by herself. And you can imagine how terrible her predicament was. She ends up being viciously raped all night, and by the mass of men there. And in the very morning, she is tossed away like trash, barely alive.
And so in that morning, the concubine wakes up dazed and confused, manages to walk and stumble her way back to the entrance of the old man's house. And upon arriving, she collapses. Her hands are placed at the very foot of the door, and there she dies. So that morning, the Levite is waking up, having apparently zero concern with the concubine he threw out last night, and prepares his journey on his way back home. He opens the front door, notices the concubine is laying there, looks at her, pokes her, prods her, kicks her, says, "Hey, get up, time to get up, time to get up." Of course, she's dead, so she does not respond, and he decides to go and take her body, puts it on his donkey, and goes on his way back to the hill country of Ephraim. And there he will take his concubine, put him on his table at his house when he arrives, cuts up her body in 12 pieces, and delivers each of the piece of her body to the different tribes of Israel. So, as you can imagine, the tribes are horrified by this event of what happened to this concubine, and they decide to have an assembly of all 12 tribes coalesce in this grand assembly in Mizpah and decide to investigate and see what happened. So they have this investigation and ask the Levite, okay, what happened? And the Levite explains the events that would happen in Gibeah, implored the assembly to rectify the situation immediately, and the assembly is outraged. They refuse to go back and dissolve and go back to their homes until justice is brought about these men who raped and killed this concubine. So they go to Benjamin, who oversees Gibeah in their territory, and they say to the representatives and the elders of Benjamin, "Hey, give us these men who are responsible." So they are to be brought to death. And Benjamin, for whatever reason, refuses to do this. So he refuses to turn them in and decides to instead go and declare war, which essentially was what happens. So the Israelites are just so outraged that they are willing to have just all-out civil war with Benjamin. And so they start out south at Mizpah and go to Gibeah, which is right next to it, and they have this 3-day long battle campaign that occurs there. So this force of 400,000 Israelites and only a little over 26,000 the tribe of Benjamin go and battle with each other. Yet Benjamin will have the upper hand through most of these battles. So the first day, the Israelites will go to battle and fight really half-heartedly because, again, they don't want to beat and kill their own tribesmen. So they become defeated and lose 22,000 soldiers that day. The second day, same thing happens. They weep in front of the Lord, really ripped apart that they have to do this, and they go in the same formation, does the same thing. They lose another 18,000 troops. So on the third day, the Judges author records 2 accounts that happen, but in both accounts, basically, there's the same strategy that Joshua had, where when he conquered Ai, where you have a decoy unit go storm the front, draw the army out, and then an ambush unit will go behind the city, raise it to the ground, and then sandwich in the army outside of the gates. And so that's what the Israelites do, and completely decimate the Benjamites. And after they overrule Gibeah, they go and they just keep going on a revenge tour. So they are not only going to take down this town, they're going to take down every Benjamin city that there is and kill almost everyone. There was only about 1,000 men that survive and go into hiding at a rock called Rephaim or Rimmon. And so they go back, and man, they are feeling really guilty about this. They are really feeling bad about it, even though they were victorious. They want their brothers not to be erased from, expunged from the tribes of Israel. So they want to revitalize the Benjamite people again after this war and to reconcile. So in chapter 21, we're introduced to 2 strange oaths that were part of the assembly when it originally happened at the beginning of chapter 20, and these oaths were really specific. So the first oath is do not intermarry with the Benjamites. The second one is to put to death anyone who does not join the assembly in the civil war efforts. So they are puzzled, they can't marry the Benjamites, how are we going to repopulate them? And so to solve this problem, they come up with the most bizarre solution possible that are a little bit within the parameters of these two oaths. So in their investigation of roll calls, they find out that there is one village that did not join the civil war efforts that should be put to the sword in Gilead, in Jabesh Gilead, up here across the Jordan. And so they decide to come up with a solution to put them to the sword, but to not kill everyone. Any virgin that they find, they're going to capture and kidnap for the Benjamins to have as wives so that they can repopulate and stabilize. So they do so, they raise the village, completely decimate it, round up 400 virgins, and bring them back to Shiloh for them to be given in marriage to the surviving Benjamites, since the village didn't partake in the original oath. So it didn't break that part of it. So they negotiates peace with Benjamites, are ready to reconcile and rebuild, and give them these virgins as, I guess, a goodwill offering into the future. However, there just wasn't quite enough Benjamites or enough virgins for the Benjamites for their quota. So there just wasn't enough virgins to go around. And the elders puzzled themselves, like, how can we solve this problem? How can we get the right quota they thought of? And so they come up with this scheme where there's going to be this big annual festival of the Lord that's going to take place at the tabernacle in Shiloh, where the holiest site is of Israel. And the elders instructed them to go take the remaining unmarried Benjamites and go hide in the vineyards and just kidnap them, the local dancing girls that are there, as they want to. And they said, hey, by the way, if the fathers or the brothers of these women complain, give them to us. We're going to give a perfectly rational explanation for this. And spoiler alert, it's not very rational. And so they somehow justify this and steal these virgin women that were dancing during the annual feast. And after the tribe of Benjamin was set, the assembly finally disbands and goes, and the tribe returns back to their territory. And the book of Judges ends this with this thematic motto that in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did as they pleased. So as we turn next time into the book of 1 Samuel, we're going to find out what's going to save Israel from this anarchy and instability, and learn about the story of Samuel and the anointment of Saul and later David.